Hey, what's up, YouTube people? Welcome back to our readings through Immerse. We at Zion are in the middle at this moment of finishing up the book Prophets from our Immerse readings. And I want to point out some things that stood out to me while I was reading Malachi. And unfortunately, I don't have one specific passage. That's typically what I've been doing. The book of Malachi is rather short, only 4 chapters long in total. So I'm going to bounce around a bit in 3 different passages, all of which sort of struck me for different reasons. So the first one I am going to read for you comes from page 424 in our book. This is probably towards the end of chapter 1, maybe the beginning of chapter 2, where God speaking says this: "The purpose of my covenant with the Levites was to bring life and peace, and that is what I gave them. This required reverence from them, and they greatly revered me and stood in awe of my name. They passed on to the people the truth of the instructions they received from me. They did not lie or cheat. They walked with me, living good and righteous lives, and they turned many from lives of sin. The words of a priest's lips should preserve knowledge of God, and people should go to him for instruction, for the priest is the messenger of Yahweh of heaven's armies. But you, priests, have left God's paths. Your instructions have caused many to stumble into sin. You have corrupted the covenant I made with the Levites, says Yahweh of heaven's armies. So I have made you despised and humiliated in the eyes of all the people. For you have not obeyed me, but have shown favoritism in the way you carry out my instructions." I think one of the reasons this passage stood out to me the most was because of how directly it speaks to priests. And it's hard to look at modern pastors in the church and have a one-for-one role from the Bible. There is the role, the gift of pastor in the New Testament, but very rarely is it talked about. That seems to have more to do with pastoral care, being a shepherd to a flock of people. Sometimes people will draw comparisons to the ancient roles of priests, even though the Levites and the priests did very specific things that pastors don't do. Last I checked, I've never been asked to slaughter animals on behalf of sacrifices to God. Sometimes the prophets, we see some similarities in what the pastoral role does nowadays, being prophetic in its voice and calling out injustices in society and within the church. Sometimes there's comparisons with the apostles and how they went along planting churches, proclaiming the good news, those kinds of things. So I'm not saying that this particular passage from Malachi is a one-to-one comparison. But there are so many similarities that just caught my attention. The role, the covenant that God gave to them was to bring life and peace. And they were to have reverence for God and to stand in awe of his name. I do not think that's any less true for pastors today. Their lips should preserve knowledge of God, and people should go to them for instruction, for they're the messenger of the God of heaven's armies. But many priests leave God's paths, and their instructions actually cause people to stumble into sin. And I think if there are pastors out there, myself included, who do not take seriously God's words, God's instruction, and how we are passing them on and or leading or misleading people, I think that's a huge concern. There's so much that can happen with cultural accommodation. There's so much that can happen with popular opinions and trends of the day, even what you might call Christian marketing. that I can't help but wonder if these words are just as relevant to leaders in the church today, that we should be careful to make sure that we revere and are in awe of the name of our God and are making sure we're teaching His instructions and not just our own preferences or personal or communal traditions. That is a good word and even a good pause to me. Another passage that stood out to me actually came from page 426 in our book, which looks like this is towards the beginning of chapter 3. So I'm going to lose my page here. Chapter 3. Again, God speaking says, "At that time I will put you on trial. I am eager to witness against all sorcerers and adulterers and liars. I will speak against those who cheat employees of their wages, who oppress widows and orphans, or who deprive the foreigners living among you of justice. For these people do not fear me, says Yahweh of heaven's armies." I think that passage in particular stood out to me because of how we sometimes identify godlessness. This is actually in the context of God saying to his people, "You have wearied me." And they say, "Well, how have we wearied you?" And he says things like, "Well, you know what? If I were to put you on trial, if I were to bear witness against you, here's the charges I would bring. You are sorcerers, you are adulterers, you are liars." And maybe we in our day would be like, yeah, those people should be put on trial from God, because clearly those things seem like they are outside the bounds of godliness. But then he goes on to say, "You cheat employees of their wages." Oh, that might get a little closer to home to us. "You oppress widows and orphans," and sometimes we support systems that are in place that make it unfairly impossible for widows and orphans to live justly and rightly. "And we deprive foreigners living among us of justice." When we do those things, we prove that we don't fear God and we don't fear his words, his way, his commands. And I can't help but wonder, especially in modern cultural debates, when we get lost in the details of what we think is right and what we think is wrong, if we've really lost the heart of God, which is, are you caring for people? Are you helping the most vulnerable? Because you trust that I have made all things, I have made all people. You can have your fair share, and unfortunately, sometimes we have more than our fair share, and we continue taking from others instead of being generous and being protective of them. More good words to think about. The last thing I want to leave with you is also at the bottom of page 426, the top of page 427, which looks like this is probably the end of chapter 3. It says, "Then those who feared Yahweh spoke with each other, and Yahweh listened to what they said. In his presence, a scroll of remembrance was written to record the names of those who feared him and always thought about the honor of his name. They will be my people, says Yahweh of heaven's armies. On the day when I act in judgment, they will be my own special treasure. I will spare them as a father spares an obedient child. Then you will again see the difference between the righteous and the wicked, between those who serve God and those who do not." How interesting to think that God tried to mix the name of God and Yahweh together there. How interesting to think that God listens in on our conversations that we have about what to do, how to behave, what is right, what is unright, what does his word say. Apparently God hears And God keeps track of those people who really want to hold on to his ways above everything else. I know sometimes we can think, what good does it do to try and walk in righteousness when nobody else seems like they're doing it? We become the odd people out. And therefore, sometimes it's just easier to accommodate. Sometimes it's just easier to do what everybody else is doing. But God notices, God cares, and God keeps track. And he says, those people will be to me like obedient children. And I will elevate them to show others the difference between righteousness and wickedness. We all can be on that list. We all can be amongst the righteous if we just keep doing and valuing God's way, his truth, his path, regardless of how hard it is or how few people travel on it. I think these are things that most stood out to me in my readings from Immerse. What stood out to you? Feel free to add them in the comments below. And because we are at the end of our prophets reading, we will not be starting Immerse readings again until the fall. So there will be a gap in this series for those of you who watch regularly online. But we will come back to it, and we will keep looking for a good word from Immerse.